For today's video, we are once again revisiting the past of Fire Emblem Heroes to re-examine some of its forgotten features. We'll be talking about two launch day weapons that kinda got left behind. One is the Poison Dagger Plus, which is only found on Kagero, and the second is the Assassin's Bow Plus, which is only found on Setsuna. I want to review what each weapon does, their usage in the early days of Fire Emblem Heroes, and discuss why they may have been forgotten, along with some other fun topics. Let's start off with the Poison Dagger Plus. As mentioned, this weapon is only found on Kagero and has been in the game since launch. It is a dagger that is effective against infantry units and is the only weapon with that ability. It's no surprise that the infantry movement type has become massively buffed since the beginning of the game, and it's largely the meta class type because of the ridiculous amount of strong skills available in it. With so many scary infantry units these days, why is no one using the Poison Dagger? Well, the biggest downside to the weapon is that it only has 5 might. That is actually just awful in the grand scheme of things. The regular default might for inheritable weapons is 12 might for ranged options. This was not always the case and only became the standard with the Weapon Refinery update, which came out during the Book 2 launch. With the Weapon Refinery, if you refine the inheritable dagger options like the Smoke or Rogue Dagger Plus, these weapons got their might buffed up to the 12 might standard. However, the Poison Dagger cannot be refined among other weapon types that didn't get that option, like Blade Tomes, Brave Weapons, or Fire Sweep weapons. Was the Poison Dagger so strong that it didn't need the buff? Well, let's run through the state of the game up until the Weapon Refinery was launched. During the early days of Fire Emblem Heroes, Kagero was a 4 to 5 star summonable unit that made her quite rare, and if you got her at 4 stars, you would need to spend 20,000 feathers to promote her to 5 stars. Back then, 20,000 feathers was incredibly hard to save up for, so for casual players, every 5-star promotion was a big investment. FEH also did not start off with skill inheritance, which means a 5-star plus attack Kagero with the Poison Dagger Plus would only hit 43 attack total. Admittedly, that's not that bad, and you could definitely one-shot a lot of low defense units. Once skill inheritance went live, you could give Kagero Death Blow 3, and it would be easier to have Hone attack buffs to support her. When Sacred Seals got introduced, you could also tack on attack plus 3. Altogether, that simple setup would get Kagero 56 attack, and you would multiply that by 1.5 times thanks to infantry effectiveness. She can actually take out a lot of units with that kind of firepower, and I do feel like it wasn't the worst idea not to bump the Poison Dagger's might even higher. The thing is that back in year 1, infantry units were not a huge problem. It was all about army units if you're playing for the very top of arena, and you also had Reinhardt and Brave Lyn dunking on your casual teams. There was also the issue of BST being a factor for arena score, so using Kagero meant you already took a huge hit to your score, but let's not get into that whole mess. So with arena having an infestation of army units who generally have really high defense stats, it wasn't really the best idea to bring a squishy dagger unit whose weapon only had 5 might. This encounter was also always a threat, so really the Poison Dagger just wasn't a good weapon to depend on at the time. In PvE content, sure, the Poison Dagger could nuke any infantry enemies, but you see all types of units like Cavaliers or Flyers. Another small issue is that the Poison Dagger doesn't have the standard AoE debuff. It only targets the one enemy, so using a Dancer would be less effective to hit multiple debuffed enemies. Overall, while the Poison Dagger gave Kagero a fun niche at assassinating infantry targets, if they had buffed it, then I guess the idea is that the infantry class would or possibly could fall farther behind the armor armada. While armor units were the arena meta, the problem is that a lot of the FEH cast is comprised of infantry units, so if we had a weapon that destroyed most of the available units, I would assume that would feel bad. Basically, that's why Reinhardt was such a menace, because he kinda just blew up everything except dedicated counters. All of this was a long time ago though, so let's now talk about Poison Dagger in the present day. The main question I guess I wanted to ask is, should we have more infantry effectiveness abilities? Well, the devs seemed to answer this question last year when they gave Kagero her unique dagger. Since she was the only unit to start with infantry effectiveness on her base weapon, Kagero was the most likely to get any kind of new infantry effectiveness ability. However, Kagero's Dart completely abandoned this unique identity and got rid of the Poison Dagger's niche, so it kinda confirms that at least at the time the devs still did not want infantry effectiveness to be a thing. I understand the concern, but it's pretty obvious that infantry units have a much bigger place in the metagame today, and they just keep getting more and more powerful skills to abuse, mainly looking at you, close call. Some infantry units have been targeted by effectiveness weapons before, and I'm mostly referring to infantry dragons, but there are also beast effectiveness weapons and the kitty paddle, which is effective against mages. One recent development was the introduction of specifically sword, lance, axe, and bow effectiveness, which came from young Shida's feather sword. This sword is just kind of ridiculous in my opinion, and it's crazy how strong it can be combined with the built-in perma advantage effect against those same weapon types. It's the closest thing we've had to infantry effectiveness, at least for sword, lance, axe, and bow units, and it feels incredibly strong. Luckily, that Sheeta isn't a standard random enemy because she would be super annoying to face. I think Feather Sword opens back up the possibility of more super effective abilities, and I'm both scared and interested in what that would do for the game. Obviously, stacking multiple types on one weapon is kinda crazy, but what if we had a lance with just sword effectiveness? Is that already too broad? Instead of countering a specific movement type, we counter a specific weapon type. Maybe a change could be to lessen the effectiveness multiplier. You could do something similar to Triangle Adept and the Weapon Triangle, which offers 1.2 times multipliers instead of the large 1.5 times multiplier. I think that could also be a way to balance out a new infantry effectiveness effect. Maybe we forego the attack increase altogether, try out new effects that only target infantry units. I don't know, there is no clear-cut answer when introducing new abilities like this. After a full 3 years of no new Poison Dagger type weapons, I would be surprised to see one now. That said, with how things have been going, I also wouldn't say it's impossible to see infantry-specific counters. I don't think the answer right now is to have stronger infantry effectiveness abilities. I think they should first give Flyers and Cavaliers better skill options to make them worth using over an infantry unit. I'm tired of the lack of new exciting skills for those classes because it just makes builds very limited. Meanwhile, if I have an infantry unit, I can go for Special Spiral, Wrath, Close Call, No Follow-Up, No See Disrupt, Impacts, Rouser, Oath buffs, and the list goes on and on. I still don't understand why Flyers and Cavs can't use Flashing Blade. It just doesn't make much sense. Let me know what you guys think about this topic. Do you still use the Poison Dagger today, and do you think it needs or deserves to get buffed? Moving on to the other topic of this video, we have the Assassin's Bow Plus, which is only found on Setsuna. I don't think I've ever seen this weapon on another unit besides Setsuna, and unlike the Poison Dagger, I would confidently say it's a much lesser used weapon by far. Some of you may not even know what this bow does, and I can't say I blame you. The Assassin's Bow Plus is an 11 might bow, and it basically has the effects of Dagger Breaker 3. When in combat against a colorless dagger foe, the user gets a guaranteed follow-up attack, and the enemy is prevented from making a follow-up attack. Technically, this is a stronger breaker skill because it has no HP requirement, so even under 50% HP, you still retain the breaker effect. The Assassin's Bow is actually quite an interesting weapon. I don't think we have ever gotten a weapon with a breaker type skill effect since this bow, and it created some cool interactions that weren't possible back in the old days. For example, you can use the Assassin's Bow with Desperation, and you will always proc Desperation off the free follow-up from the weapon. You could have a 0-speed archer that would double any dagger enemies with 2 consecutive attacks if they were under 75% HP. Another fun trick is to use the Assassin's Bow with Wind Sweep. The guaranteed follow-up attack would cancel out Wind Sweep's follow-up prevention, allowing you to possibly land 2 attacks without dagger units being able to counter back. The obvious issue is that these interactions only work on dagger enemies, and back in year 1, dagger units were terrible. Remember how I said the inheritable dagger weapons got buffed with the weapon refinery? That was for a good cause, because the early day dagger units were just so mediocre. Literally everyone instead just used archers because they had the brave bow, which was easily the best bow for most types of content. It's the same idea as to why the Poison Dagger wasn't as popular, because there were tanky arm units all over the place. No one would use the Assassin's Bow because no one was using dagger units. While there are much better dagger units available today, another issue is that the Assassin's Bow only works on colorless dagger units, and now we have red, blue, and green daggers too. Even though the Assassin's Bow was a super niche weapon that pretty much saw 0 usage, it did not get a refine option either. In fact, the Assassin's Bow got a weapon evolution where it turned into the Guard Bow. The Guard Bow Plus has built-in Distant Defense 3, which is a far cry from Dagger Breaker, although obviously a much more useful ability. This is another case where it seems like the devs just completely abandoned the breaker skill idea, and honestly, that was a good call in terms of making an inheritable weapon that people would actually want to inherit. I now want to discuss something that's been debated about before, and that's the idea of introducing Reaver type weapons to the game. I want to preface this by saying this is all in good fun. I'm not pushing for anything serious here. For those not familiar, the GBA Fire Emblem games had the Sword Reaver, the Lance Reaver, and the Axe Reaver. These weapons would actually reverse the weapon triangle. So the Sword Reaver was an axe weapon that would be strong against swords but weak to lances. Now these weapons had a place because in regular Fire Emblem games you can carry multiple weapons. So it was fine to have your Reaver weapon in your back pocket in case you had to face a unit's weaker matchup. In Fade though, we only have one weapon at a time, and the weapon triangle is much more simplified to the red, blue, and green system. It does seem a bit pointless to have Reaver weapons work by reversing the weapon triangle, because instead of having a green unit be strong against red foes, you could have just instead brought a blue unit in the first place with a then much more useful combat ability. I think instead we can adopt a different approach, and the Assassin's Bow is one example. Instead of reversing the weapon or color triangle, you could use the Breaker skill ability of guaranteeing a follow-up while denying the enemy a follow-up for one specific weapon type. In fact, the reason the Assassin's Bow specifically targets dagger enemies is probably due to the fact that in Fire Emblem Fates, which Setsuna is from, bows and daggers are lumped into the weapon triangle, with bows being strong against daggers. Now in Fade, the Swordbreaker, Lancebreaker, and Axebreaker abilities cannot be used by their weaker matchups. Basically, an Axe unit cannot run Swordbreaker. I think Reaver weapons or even unique weapons would be interesting if we got rid of that restriction, so our Axe Reaver would have Swordbreaker built in. You still get hit by the weapon triangle disadvantage, but you gain the upper hand in the follow-up battle, and it still has clear weaknesses to no follow-up abilities. Personally, I think at this point emulating the full Reaver weapon effect with an equal disadvantage would make the weapon too awkward. So like if Axe Reaver gave us Swordbreaker, I don't think it should give Lance foes Axebreaker against us, if that makes sense. Because Faye only uses a one weapon system, I think it's just easier to go with a smaller advantage with little or no drawbacks. To bring things around, Reaver type weapons could instead use effectiveness abilities like we mentioned earlier, so the Sword Reaver would be effective against Lance foes. With this, the 1.5 times effectiveness multiplier would clash with the minus 20% attack penalty from the weapon triangle disadvantage. You would also still take extra damage to the weaker matchup like normal. For example, young Shida with her feather sword would deal more damage to Lance enemies, but she still is weak to them naturally. I think this might be a way to incorporate more weapon specific abilities, but it would feel a bit weak if that was the only ability on a weapon. For the sake of variety, I think a Reaver type weapon would be interesting to see. I don't think simply reversing the weapon triangle is the way to adapt them into Fae, but maybe it could work. That's gonna be it for this video, and hopefully you learned something about the Poison Dagger and the Assassin's Bow. On one hand, the chaos and updated infantry effectiveness weapon would bring sounds insane, but I kind of feel like infantry units are getting out of hand. I hope this year I can be incentivized to use more Cavaliers, Flyers, and Arm units, and actually feel like I got some build options to choose from. On the topic of super effective abilities, I am curious how they're going to handle Dimitri's Atrocity. They gave Legendary Edelgard Raging Storm, so I feel like they're going to give Dimitri Atrocity, and that move is effective against all unit types, so can you imagine that in this game? It's going to be insane. Alright, that's enough rambling for one video. We got the July update coming soon, and Summer Part 2 is on the way. I'll see you guys next time.